All right, everybody, welcome into the Fifth Dimension podcast. For today's show, I am joined by Father Seán ÓLaoire. Seán, such a honor and pleasure to be able to connect. I mean, there's so much I could say about your background and the work and message that you're bringing right now. So, I'm excited to see where this conversation goes, and to have you on today.
Me too. Thanks a million, Evan, for the invite.
Yeah, absolutely. And shout out to Paul Check for bridging the connection. I mean, he reached out and he
Amen.
said, "Hey, I have a wonderful guest for your podcast." And I was, I take his words very highly as well. So, and I started diving into your work and I agreed with Paul. I'm like, all right, I definitely need to have this conversation. So, um, been very excited about it for a while. I mean, I'd love to start, maybe if you could just give the listeners a little bit of your own backgrounds and the perspective that you're bringing to the table. And, I would say how your own journey and the work that you've done over the many years has really shaped your perspective in the now and what you find your focus to be in this present moment where it does feel like we really need to be step up and be in alignment. So, I'd love to hear about your journey and where you're at right now.
So I'm Irish. I'll talk at the drop of a hat. So if we're still going at 6 p.m. tonight, shut me down.
Well, I won't mind.
So obviously, I was raised in Ireland. I was raised bilingually, Gaelic and English. And so actually, until I got to college, all of my education was through the medium of Gaelic. So I learned mathematics through Gaelic and geography through Gaelic and English through Gaelic. And I was the firstborn of a firstborn of a firstborn. And so I was actually raised by my grandparents for the first 6 years. And my great grandmother was living with us. In fact, I was almost 10 years old before she died. And she was definitely a Christian mystic for her. And I used to call her, I couldn't pronounce her name, so I used to call her Muddy. And it stuck, no pun intended. And so she was, for her, Mother Mary was more real than you are to me right now, Evan. And so I would hear her talking to Mary all day long. And obviously, I was only privy to one side of the conversation. But for me, then, Mother Mary was real. And so this, the thin place, in Gaelic, we have a phrase called ÓLaoire, which means a thin place where the veil between the mystical and the mundane is diaphanous, or between the secular and the sacred. And there are some locations where that's very true. And there are times of the year when that's true, like Christmas time, or Bealtaine for the Celts, the 1st of May, or Samhain, the 1st of November. But I believe as well there are what I call thin people, that they're like mobile tabernacles of the transcendent. They're people, whom, if you happen to be in their company, it's like they radiate this energy, and it's like they escort you through the veil, and you temporarily get to see what they're witnessing and what they're living in. So she was such a character, Muddy. So I got all these great mystical stories she told me about, stuff that never appeared in the Bible, but you find it actually in some of the Gnostic scriptures, like the infancy gospel of Thomas or the infancy gospel of James that never made it to the official canon of scripture. And she had all these stories. So that was one influence. And then at age 6, I was given over to my other grandparents, my maternal grandparents, with whom my parents were living then. And I encountered my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who was, I called him Daddy Jim. And he was a druid. He was a brilliant musician, played all kinds of instruments. He was a consummate Irish step dancer, and he was the best storyteller I've ever come across in my life. So I got these two kind of systems kind of interweaving. Mystical Christianity and pre-Christian Celtic Druidry. And then, at the end of high school, I went to the seminary for 8 years, studying, I went to the University College Cork. I studied mathematics and mathematical physics. And then in the seminary, I studied theology and scripture and church history and philosophy. And then at age 26, I went to Kenya and spent 14 years in Kenya before actually I was forced out by the government for work I was doing on social justice. So then I get to kind of, I was lucky enough to learn 4 different Kenya languages and to kind of immerse myself in their mythologies. And I came to the conclusion that storytelling or mythology is the archived wisdom of a culture. If you really want to know the deep, deep wisdom of any culture, go to their stories and go to their proverbs. The proverbs are like the distillation of their wisdom, and the stories are the kind of the epic kind of sagas that they tell about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember when I was in high school, the year before, between junior year and senior year, I spent the entire summer holidays in a little village in Ireland called ÓLaoire, where Gaelic is still the mother tongue. And I started collecting proverbs from the old people there. And in Gaelic, the word for proverb is Seán ÓLaoire, which literally means ancient words.
Uh-huh.
And I would collect, I go to a household, interview the elders there, ask them, can you give me some proverbs and tell me in what context you'd use them and what do they actually mean? And I remember one old man saying to me, he said, if Christianity had never come to Ireland, we could live according to the proverbs. And he was absolutely right. And subsequently, that was my experience in Africa. Although I was there as a missionary, I learned very quickly that if Christianity had never gone to Africa, they could live according to their proverbs. And so what I did then was to try to become some kind of what Carl Jung would call a Gnostic intermediary, somebody who was really, really well versed in two different traditions and can cross-fertilize them to their mutual benefit. So what I attempted to do then was, I'm going to share my Christian and my Celtic mythology with you, and you share your African mythology with me, and then we see what comes of the cross-fertilization. So at age 40, I was actually kicked out of Kenya for my work in social justice. I came to the States in 1987, and then I did a PhD in transpersonal psychology. And so I work as a licensed clinical psychologist part-time, and then I'm the spiritual director for a non-denominational group of people called Companions on the Journey. And so that's where that's where I'm at right now.
Awesome. Well, when you're speaking about this idea of mythology and storytelling, this is something I'm very interested in uncovering the roots of sort of our own cultural stories and the phenomenons that really shape who we perceive ourselves to be, right? We're in an age of globalization.
Yes.
Globalism is a major, I'd say, the driving political ideology and story about the current time period. And it seems to me like there isn't much of a, because, you being in Africa, you immersed yourself in that cross-fertilization process.
Right.
To me, it doesn't seem like there is much of a, I guess, a cross-fertilization taking place to unpack a new global story, a new global myth. Because, it feels like a global consciousness and a recognition of our oneness is coming to being, right? We have this global consciousness that is emerging, yet without this cross-fertilization taking place, we're sort of allowing ourselves to be guided into more of a conformity instead of an actual recognition of our oneness, right? And we're being guided into something that maybe isn't in alignment with the true nature of who we are and recognizing the beauties of all of our different cultures, right? So, I was wondering if you could unpack what you feel maybe the cultural myth or story is of the present time, and how we begin to maybe begin to engage in this cross-fertilization process, because I don't think it's going to take place from a top-down level by any means with these institutions or governments or even dogmatic religions, right? So, what does that process look like to you?
So that's a brilliant point, Evan. So let me start off with a metaphor. When you look at the evolution of life on our little planet, it started about 3.7 billion years ago. And it started initially with single-cell creatures. And they were the only life form on the planet for about 1.5 billion years. And then at some stage, they developed, into multicellular organisms. And then we got marine life at some stage. And then we got amphibians who came out and could live on land and sea. And then we got the reptilians who only live on land. And then at some stage, we got mammalian life. And then we got hominids, and then eventually Homo sapiens, and then eventually Homo sapiens sapiens. But what I see when I look at that evolution is that every level of this has an independence. Every single, you've got about 70 trillion cells in your body, but every single cell is actually It's independent in the sense that it has all of the subsystems that the entire organism has. Every single cell has an elimination system, a cardiovascular system, a kind of a respiratory system. So it doesn't give that up when they come together in little clans or families, and they decide, a billion cells decide to become an organ. So they become a heart, or they become a liver, or they become a kidney. They're not giving up their individuality as cells in order to operate as organs. And then a bunch of organs get together and they operate as a kind of a family of organs that creates the entire organism. And so there you are now. You've got all these subsystems, a cardiovascular system, a respiratory system, an elimination system, a neurological system. But none of these are sacrificing themselves, in order to become part of the totality. And that's the danger right now, the difference between the cross-fertilization of all of these cells of mythologies and ways of doing life with the notion of a globalization that has to kill all the independence and then create this blended thing, this soup, in which there are no languages left anymore or no cultures left anymore. There's just this kind of goo, which is presided over by some kind of a self-appointed oligarchy. So it's the difference between dialogue and kind of control. It's one thing to engage with people and for us to learn from each other. It's another thing for us to impose a system. And when you look at colonialism, there are many types of colonialism. There's military colonialism where you go in with a crowd of troops like Cortes did, in the 1590s and destroyed an entire continent. Or you can go in and just destroy a person's language. And if you destroy language, you destroy their culture. And if you destroy their culture, you kill their stories. And if you kill their stories, you kill their cosmologies. And if you kill their cosmologies, you kill their soul. And that's the danger in our times right now, that there's this effort at this blenderization rather than cross-fertilization. And so I've been saying for many years now that I'm witnessing what I call a trifurcation, that Homo sapiens sapiens is kind of emerging into three different possibilities. The first one I call Homo sociopathicus. And these are the people, who are interested in grabbing the resources of the world, gaining total control over everything and imposing their will on everybody else. I call that Homo sociopathicus. And the second group I call it Homo artificialis. These sociopaths are trying to create a transhumanist agenda where, there's a whole group of people, the vast bulk of the population, who are, programmable and hackable. That literally AI is taking over and we're just walking robots under the control of Homo sociopathicus. And the third group I call Homo spiritualis. And there are people who are waking up and are aware of what's happening and realize that this is the challenge and the invitation of our time, that every single one of us volunteered to be here now. Nobody's here by mistake. But, incarnation creates a kind of amnesia for who we really are and what our purpose and what our mission is. And so Homo spiritualis are the people who are waking up and trying to create what I would call Christ consciousness or Buddha nature or self-realization. I don't care what word you give to it, but that realization that we are all God stuff, that literally, I coined a phrase years ago that, everything that exists, whether it's an oak tree, a bunny rabbit, or a human being, is simply God in drag, that there is nothing which is not God. But we've lost sight of that. We have separated ourselves out, as separate little pods, that my skin encapsulated ego separates me from you and your skin encapsulated ego. So the trick is to find our common divinity, which does not mean the blenderization of personalities, but rather the full flowering and the cross-fertilization of personalities in relationships and of cultures on a global level.
Right. Absolutely. And with, you could speak to your experience if you went into Africa as, let's say, a missionary versus somebody taking on the role of trying to blend the cultures in a more harmonious way. You would have been taking on that almost sociopathic approach of, enforcing your own culture and ideology upon a group of individuals, and in the process destroying their culture, destroying their stories. So, and I think we can all take a step back and look at imperialism, colonialism throughout the years and the various forms that it has taken upon. And it feels now that the evolution of colonialism is one that is directly infringing upon the soul through the various technologies that we've been able to create. And it's very much more psychological and spiritual in the type of, I'd say, imperialistic fashion that it's taking on versus the military conquests, or,
Yes,
even looking at the last century and a half where it's really been an economic form of imperialism throughout the
exactly,
world.
exactly.
It's very much a interesting evolution in that. And, I look at, let's say, religion, for example, and this is an area that you have so much background in. Uh, if we look at like mystic traditions throughout
Yes,
I'd say throughout the history of civilization, you have these movements that emerge where we try and bring in this recognition of our Christ consciousness or Buddha nature, right? And there's been times throughout history where there has been large scale movements, but it seems like each time it's come up, it has been sort of squashed. There hasn't been a
yes,
large scale
yes, yes.
embracing of this. And if history is to repeat itself in that sense, then you would think we're destined for the same fate. But I
Mm,
mean, what do you think of these times in comparison to our historical, I guess, looking back at the historical
yeah.
uh, uh, references and the cycles that we tend to go through? Uh, do you believe this time is going to, I guess maybe it's going to be different, or how this resembles certain movements of the past, and I guess how we can really engage in this process of recognizing our own Christ consciousness and Buddha nature,
Right,
uh,
right.
to actually help usher that in and not allow this top down approach
Yes,
to once again
right,
squander that or make us ultimately disconnected from it.
right. It's a great question, brilliant question. So I'm a big believer, Evan, in the cyclical nature of human evolution and human history. I don't
Mhm.
believe it's a linear thing. So I'm a big fan of the notion of the Mahayugas in Hinduism. And we find that actually in Celtic mythology and many other mythologies as well, that this is not our first rodeo. As a species or even as individuals, we've incarnated in previous periods, maybe even in different kind of on different planets. Watching this process unfold. So I really believe that there are two ways of repeating history. One is to go round and round and round in a circle and dig yourself deeper and deeper and deeper into a rut. And the other way is to go around in a spiral, that we're
Mhm.
going to meet the same kinds of issues throughout our evolutionary trajectory. But if we do it with more mindfulness, we're not just revisiting the same issues on the same kind of two-dimensional plane. We're cycling in a spiral fashion. So this notion of in mathematics is called a graph going asymptotic. If you take just a two-dimensional graph, you have let's say a y-axis and an x-axis, and this is measuring time and this is measuring change. And then as change happens faster and faster and faster, the graph becomes asymptotic. It's not going in a straight line. It's beginning to go steeper and steeper and steeper until finally there's more change in less time, and ultimately there's infinite change in zero time. And that in mathematics is called going asymptotic. Now that's a two-dimensional version. I believe a few weeks ago I had this vision of a three-dimensional asymptote. So you imagine a right circular cylinder, like a long, 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 long pipe,
Mhm.
and there's an energy moving through it, and it's not just going around in circles on a kind of a plane. It's spiraling upwards inside this, and the spiral is getting steeper and steeper and steeper until finally the spiral itself goes asymptotic. So you're getting an infinite amount of change in a zero amount of time, not just two-dimensionally, but three-dimensionally. And so I see this opportunity in our planet right now to go literally asymptotic in our evolutionary process. But there are two ways that can happen. It can happen through just transhumanism, where we're just literally robots and we're developing just an intellectual capacity to use our neuronal brain, or we can do it by waking up to our Christ consciousness and realize, that we are divine beings who volunteered to shift the entire consciousness of the planet. And so
Mhm.
I believe that until things get bad enough, most people won't wake up. And if things get bad, a few people wake up temporarily, put a band-aid on it, and then go back to sleep.
Yeah.
It has to get really, really bad for an extended period of time for enough people to wake up fully and stay awake. And then we break through to the next level of the evolution. So we're on the cusp at this stage. We're either going to break down or break through. So
Right.
it depends just on how many people wake up and how much kind of energy they commit to the process.
Right. And what you were just talking about, I've had many conversations with another Irishman, actually, James Tunney,
Yeah,
and he's been on Paul Check's podcast a few times as well. And
yeah,
he's very much as well versed in the transhumanism movement and how there's been sort of a manipulation of our spiritual consciousness. And what you just said really kind of it almost mirrors his sentiment
it does.
exactly, where he talks about this idea of in transhumanism, they're almost creating this loop, right? And it's this loop that we can almost contain ourselves within,
Yes, yes,
where in a way we exit our normal because the soul has its own evolution. We have
yes,
our own evolution of our spiritual consciousness, but
yes,
with this loop that's being created in the transhumanist movement, it's almost as if we're bypassing our natural
yes,
evolutionary spiritual development and trapping ourselves within this loop that feeds this system, and ultimately where our souls and our
mm,
spiritual consciousness is used to
mm,
sort of, I guess it's the energy of it is harvested in a sense to power this autonomous system, this transhumanist ideology. And really the only way to exit that trap that's been created within society is to embrace I guess there's a natural spiraling and loop process of the soul's development and
yes,
really step into ourselves fully and
yes,
embody the Christ consciousness. And that spiral, that
yes,
imagery in me, it makes me think of the Kundalini energy within
absolutely,
the
absolutely,
ourselves, right? And so
brilliant, brilliant.
the internal really can mirror what we're
Yeah,
seeing
yeah.
externally. But do you feel that it's possible? James talks about our soul being, um, not necessarily losing it, where we completely sell it off or that it becomes forever trapped within this. But I do see real dangers of, being lost within this
Yes,
transhumanist movement, of
yeah,
us losing the natural
yes,
cycles that our soul is supposed to go through, or the
yes,
evolution that we're supposed to take place, and we really stagnate ourselves on more than just a material plane.
yes.
I mean, do you feel that is a real danger in this time to lose oneself within these ideologies, or on the grand scheme of it, and let's say after this lifetime and we pass on, if we were to be, really stuck in this loop, as James would put it, um, are we confining ourselves to come back and reincarnate into that same experience? What is sort of, I guess, your thoughts on the bigger picture outside of this, even in this body, if the different paths, I would say, that are presenting itself right now, if that makes
Well,
sense.
great questions, and I love what you're reporting of his viewpoint. And so when I had this vision a few weeks ago about this, three-dimensional spiral going asymptotic, there's a flip side to that as well,
Uh,
because the transhumanist agenda is not just to stop that upward spiral; it's actually to try to reverse it. So they're
yeah,
forcing what is, even those of us who identify with our physical spacesuits, at least we're identifying with an organic, a spacesuit which is composed of organic matter. Now they're trying to force us down into identification with inorganic matter, like we're going from carbon-based life forms to silicon-based life forms. So
yeah,
it's actually a spiral that's going down deeper and deeper into kind of nothingness. I had this great dream. I work with my dreams quite a bit. And a few nights ago, I asked for some kind of guidance around the difference between sin and evil. And I woke up with this statement in my mind. And what I heard, my higher self say, or the divine say, was this: that sin is the individual transgression of culturally created precepts, but evil is the cosmic conspiracy using human intermediaries to separate souls from source.
mm,
So this is not just a matter of degree, this is a matter of category. That literally, sin is just the breaking a law, trespassing a precept or whatever. And all laws are culturally created. They're based on moral principles like respect for life or truth or whatever, but they're basically made up laws. Like, for instance, what do you call the governor of California the last year signed 900 new laws into effect. So it's almost impossible not to be a lawbreaker. And
right.
so breaking a law is very different from being evil. But evil for me feels like it's a concerted, cosmically orchestrated conspiracy using human intermediaries to actually force a separation between souls and source. Now, I don't think that can ever be permanent, but it can create a situation where people are going to get stuck when they die, physically stuck. They can get stuck in the astral planes, and be kind of hungry ghosts, to use the kind of the Buddhist notion. And so it's very difficult for them to kind of continue with the transition after death. And when they reincarnate, they're reincarnating into a lower level of incarnation, a place where they're still stuck with a kind of an inorganic, silicon-based, transhumanist sense of self. So it's going to be a lot harder work to kind of get out of that pit and go back up. And that, for me, one is the great beauty of a character like Jesus. There's a great, teaching in Christianity, in mystical Christianity, that the 3 days that Jesus was in the tomb, that he descended into hell. That's the phrase that's used. So it's like he took the spiral all the ways down to the ultimate pit of darkness and appeared in separation from source in order to set it free, to experience it for himself, and then to kind of free those who were stuck at that level. And that's the Christ consciousness, or the Buddha nature. It is to be able to plumb the depths of the darkness, but not get identified with it, and therefore to try to raise up those who are still stuck there, whether you call that an astral level or whatever. And so I don't believe that ultimately, in an eternal way, that any kind of bite-sized bit of God can be separated from God for eternity. But that when we're stuck in time, it can feel like that, and that's the danger. How long do we want to be feeling like that?
Right, absolutely. And what you're speaking to, I mean, there's so many different ways I could branch off, because there's so many great ideas that you just outlined. If we're going to take the notion of being the Christ, for example, right? If we're to um, embody that, you could say that this time period is necessary for us to experience what it's like to go all the way down the spiral. And when you go purely into the darkness and you disconnect from spirit, and for us to be the Christ, which I feel is the ultimate teachings of Jesus, right? For us to embody that Christ consciousness, we need to actually understand what evil is, what the darkness is in this type of manifestation, right? So you could argue that it is necessary to step into these times. And, the very word compassionate is to be with suffering. Like, if you look at the deepest meaning of it. So I think it is, in a way, that can put it into context for a lot of people. Maybe, why is this taking place? It's an opportunity for us to recognize and then be further liberated from I would say, the cultural systems and technologies and all of these ideas and ideologies that have been placed onto us, because we recognize the illusions of, what happens when you attach oneself to the darkness. We see exactly that process that you just described. And I do think that makes it necessary for us right now, as difficult as it is to say, oh, this is all necessary. And obviously we want to avoid and minimize the suffering as much as possible. We also have to recognize that we can't necessarily take other people's suffering away, because are we doing them a disservice to try and eliminate what their soul has signed up for in certain senses? So it's really about coming back to within ourselves with our own heart. And I would say allow that compassion to lead by example, because and ultimately embody the Christ. I think that's one of the most, I would say, pure teachings throughout history that we can keep coming back to. And I think it's why people keep coming back to it. That's I think that's the lesson of this time. But I think you articulated that beautifully.
So I agree 100% with you, and you did it beautifully. And I want to kind of work with the notion of compassion a little bit more. So there's a great statement. It's in Luke's Gospel where Jesus says, "You must be compassionate as your heavenly Father is compassionate." Now, Luke is writing in Greek, but Jesus is speaking in Aramaic. And if you look at the word in Aramaic that Jesus is using for father, it's avon. And avon literally means the birthing principle of the cosmos, that which manifests and generates all that is. And the word compassion in Aramaic is the word rachamim. And rachamim is the plural in Aramaic for the word for a womb. So here's what Jesus is saying is, you must be womb-like, just as the birthing principle of the cosmos, that which brought everything into being, is womb-like. So you think about, what does a womb represent? a womb is that faculty that allows us to conceive, to carry, and to give birth to life, to new life. Now, it can do it sequentially, not just once, but many times. And so here's what I hear Christ saying. You must be womb-like in the sense that you must keep giving birth to greater and greater versions of yourself and greater versions of Homo sapiens sapiens until you finally give birth to God. There was a great Christian mystic in the 1300s, Meister Eckhart, who said very famously in a Christmas homily, he said, "Of what use to me is it that my Savior was born of a virgin 1300 years ago? If he's not born again in my time and in my heart, every single one of us is meant to be the mother of God." And so I really believe that that ultimately is the mission of the individual soul. It is during incarnation to give birth to God, which means basically just self-realization with a capital S, realizing that there is only God. Yeah, and then waking everybody else up to the realization, and you are, and so is an oak tree, and so is a bunny rabbit. It's just different levels of self-awareness within different kinds of life forms, but they're all ultimately manifestations of source. And so what I hear is this, that the first thing we give birth to, as human beings, is an ego. About the age of 8 months, a child suddenly realizes that itself and its mother are not a kind of a mother-child complex, a single organism that the child controls, but that the mother is separate from it. And then the ego develops and is terrifying. I'm on my own here, So the first thing we give birth to is our ego. Then we start giving birth to our emotions. We identify with our emotions. Then we start identifying with our ideas, our mentation. Then we start identifying with relationships. Then we start identifying with the job we're doing. And so all of this, great, keep birthing, but you're not finished giving birth until you realize that you're God stuff and that everybody else is God stuff. So that's the trajectory. So that literally is what compassion means. It is to keep giving birth until you give birth to the divine.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's true for me of the individual journey, but it's true of the cultural journey of every community, and it's true of the global family. And I totally agree with you then that in order to kind of experience that level of compassion, you have to experience the notion of radical disidentification from God, or radical separation from God that we're witnessing in our times.
Right. And that's definitely what we're born into in the cultural story that is presented. And, I think what's interesting is I look at sort of the cultural stories and the ideas behind transhumanism. And in a way, I feel it almost takes an inverted approach of what you just described. And I think, because, I think these stories and these teachings and, what Jesus talked about, for example, these are within ourselves. We know them to be true, which is, why a lot of people will resonate with them, even if they're not necessarily practicing in their own life. Why do they keep showing up for church on Sunday, even if they're not living in the Christ consciousness, for example, right? There's a deep yearning for, I would say, mysticism within our culture. But I look at, transhumanist ideology, for example, and, you all know Harari talks about humans will become gods. And it talks about technology as the birth, really as a birth of a god, right? And so it kind of takes what you were just describing and this deep spiritual truth and inverts it in a way where we're creating it externally, thinking that this creation is what you just described. And I think that's why maybe so many people are enticed by it, because, maybe they view technology as the place to explore that vast infinite that we are yearning for, that mystic exploration that I think many people have a yearning for in their hearts. They see it externally in the transhumanist movement, for example, and so they'll go into it and kind of fall for the allure of it instead of recognizing that that's within ourselves. Because when we externalize it, we're really negating the notion of our own divine worth. It's like having to go to the priest to find God, or it kind of plays on a lot of the stories throughout history, just in a more updated fashion, really, right? So to me, it feels very dangerous that there's this spiritual inversion, not just a negation of spirituality, because I don't think a complete negation of it would work, but it really does have to have this radical inversion where you give elements of truth and stories that have elements of the original truth within it, only laced with illusions and laced with false ideas, so that people will actually feel a connection to it and then go into it without sort of recognizing that internal process. I mean, because I would love to hear your thoughts on that and how.
I think it's brilliant. It's beautifully articulated. And there was an image just came to mind as I listened to you right now, Evan. I'm sure you've seen videos of people who are trying to round up wild horses. And there's a huge movement at the moment, you know, in some parts of our country to eliminate wild horses and the Mustangs, literally killing them by the tens of thousands. And so the system is you create a kind of fences that are kind of vectoring in slowly until finally they wind up in a circle, you know, with a narrow aperture that you can drop a gate across. And so you've got these, you know, carriages out, you know, with helicopters driving horses. And I can imagine as a Mustang that the feeling is there lies freedom. I got to run in that direction to be totally free from, you know, this force that's attacking me. And so they run and they're being guided by these two rails to the side. And what they don't realize is going to get narrower and narrower and narrower. And finally, it's going to wind up in a corral, which can be closed off completely by dropping just one particular gate. And so they're fleeing allegedly for freedom. They're moving away from that which is upsetting them into this. And what they don't realize, they wind up in a corral with a gate shut and now they're trapped. And so this kind of seduction that we're being offered freedom by some levels of technology, and obviously technology is good if it's used well, but that there's this kind of this carrot, this is going to set you free. You're going to become gods, but you're going to become gods only temporarily until we kind of hack you and program you, because it's going to be a pyramid. And you guys will be in the very bottom of the pyramid, and there's going to be an oligarchy who are the real gods, calling all the shots and programming who you are and what you're capable of thinking. So the kind of the alleged freedom is literally just corralling you into a place where ultimately there are gods, self-created gods, but they're the crowd at the very top. And ultimately, when you look at human history, when you create that kind of a pyramid, the crowd at the top don't last very long, because they're now going to start fighting, because there's still 3 or 4 levels of the pyramid above. And the guys at the very pinnacle right now are going to try wipe out the guys at level 3 or over 4. And finally, you got the guy at the very top being assassinated, and the whole system starts over again. And so you're absolutely right. This kind of inverted notion of divinity, which is not just kind of the absence of the reality, but the inversion and the total kind of negation of what it means to be a free child of God.
Right, absolutely. And, you know, I think in order to recognize what it means to be a free child of God, in the purest sense, we really do have to have a complete detachment from these systems and recognize that if all of this were to come, you know, crashing down around us, can we still recognize ourselves on the other side, right? Step into the flames directly, let the old ideas and illusions and ideologies, you know, burn. And can we reemerge? It's like the great mythology of the phoenix and be reborn into the purest sense. And I think our fear of death, for example, is, you know, it's an ultimate manifestation of the fear of the unknown. In a lot of ways, God without our cultural strings attached to it, that's a huge unknown for a lot of people. Absolutely. So, and you know, I have yet to read your book, Setting God Free. I have it in my cart, a bunch of different books. I'm planning on ordering it. But when your title, Setting God Free, you know, for me, that's the type of feeling that it invokes. It's like, all right, beyond the cultural ideals, beyond all of these stories we've come to know, and really, I guess, stepping into a radical presence. And what do you find when you're in the complete space of the now? I mean, every moment, by that definition, is going to be a complete mystery, because you're not in your stories of the past. You don't have your ideas in your frameworks about what you expect, right? So you're kind of living in alignment with the great mystery, and by definition, a mystery that's unknown to the rational mind. So I think that, in the purest sense, is why people have this immense fear and almost an unwillingness to step into that radical presence of God, because, you know, they don't know what to expect. But to me, that feels like the only path of freedom, the only path of actually unlocking who it is that we are and how we are really meant to be living in the purest sense. And that's walking hand in hand with that great mystery, right?
Yes. Yes. And part of the problem is precisely that, I believe that all religions begin with some kind of a mystical impulse,
Yeah.
but they go through the following kinds of stages almost inevitably. So you get some great avatar like a Jesus figure or a Buddha figure or a Mahatma Gandhi figure, who is really charismatic and deeply mystical. And so a bunch of people get attracted. That's stage 2. There's a kind of a community begins to form around. Almost inevitably, such a character is going to get assassinated or eliminated. So that's stage 3. Stage 4 is that the community now organizes itself into an organization with rules, and membership and stuff like that. The 5th stage is that some kind of a self-appointed oligarchy will rise to the top and take control of the organization. Stage 6 is they will insist on orthodoxy, some kind of a creedal formulation without which you can't be a member of our group. And then, the next stage is inquisitions. Literally, they'll tear members apart limb from limb, for not following the orthodox teaching. And if they have power outside, they begin crusades, to attack the infidels. Then at some stage, there'll be some new prophetic figure, like Francis of Assisi in the 1200s, who wanted to call back this Jesus movement back into, alignment with what it really was at the beginning. And so he founds a whole new community called the Franciscans, with this great idealism. And it goes through the very same stages. Within 300 years, it is the Franciscan order in Europe that's in charge of the Inquisition, literally pulling people limb from limb. And so it's almost, and you see this in every kind of group. It's not just in religion. You find it in economics. You find it in NGOs. You find it in kind of any kind of movement of humans, initially led by compassion, but inevitably becoming, some kind of an institution, with rules and regulations. And so the question then becomes, how do we kind of keep that spirituality alive? Because in a sense, religion is merely the training wheels for spirituality. Religion has a function. It's great for creating community. It's great for creating ritual that can, shift your kind of state of consciousness so that you can have individual mystical experiences. But instead of creating ritual that allows the individual members to have Gnostic knowledge, in other words, personal mystical encounters, they force them, to kind of sign off on a creedal formulation. I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, or whatever. And so there's this constant movement to kind of rekindle the embers of mysticism. And I believe that's where the future is headed. I invented a term many years ago called mysticists. In fact, I'm leading an entire seminar, 3-day seminar on it in March. I call it Mysticists, the Future of Humanity. And mysticists for me is a cross-fertilization between mystics and scientists, people like Tyler Desjardins, people who are really conversant with the scientific method, and at the same time are mystics. And for me, that is the next stage of human evolution, that, we will encounter more and more mysticists and be invited ourselves to become mysticists, that we can use what is best in the scientific method, and win that with what is best in the mystical, the part of us that's encountered, that experiences through soul. So I differentiate between knowledge and wisdom. For me, knowledge is simply data generated by the sensorium and processed by the brain, whereas wisdom is data which is generated by the soul and processed by the heart. So there's a huge difference between wisdom and knowledge. So the mysticists for me are people who are conversant with both. They know how to kind of deal with the physical cosmos, and much more importantly, they know how to cross-fertilize that with the metaphysical cosmos. And for me, that's the future to which we're being beckoned.
Wow, beautiful. That's beautiful. And I think in science in particular could use a little bit of the heart and wisdom ingrained within it. If we look at our cultural system and the stories we tell ourselves, it is very much rational, knowledge based. I mean, you can make the argument we have more knowledge and information at our disposal than ever before. And there is a beauty in that. There is a reverence we can hold and feel grateful for the accessibility of knowledge and information. But there is within that, if it's not, I would say ultimately contained within the heart space and held to that, the knowledge in itself almost becomes our detriment. You know, it becomes something that holds us back from a deeper level of understanding. And I think if anything, that's a very necessary,
Absolutely.
cause that you're embarking upon. It's to bridge that, because I think really, if you look at what is the function of religion or what is the function of science, a lot of people have historically wanted to
Yes.
separate the two,
Yes.
but in reality, they're both methods that we
Yes.
have adapted in an attempt to explain and understand reality and explain and understand who we are.
Right.
And if that's, the old adage, know thyself, I
Yes.
think that's really the golden question most people have,
Yes.
even if they don't realize that's the question they're after or they're seeking. Um, I think bridging the gap between those two it's vitally important. And something I've heard you talk about in one of your YouTube videos was this idea of seeking versus seeing, right?
Yes. Yes.
And
Yes.
I think that
Yes.
really applies here, because even
Yeah.
if we're going into science or going into
Yeah.
mysticism, if we're seeking, there's a big difference between seeing and just
Right.
experiencing and being
Right.
present with it. And I was wondering if you could expand on that, because I feel that it is
Yeah.
a very important concept,
Yeah.
especially in
So,
regards to this.
right. So there's a statement you find in the New Testament in several of the Gospels where it says, ask and you shall receive, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened. And that's kind of a tripartite, asking, seeking, and knocking. When you read the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, there's a very different version of it. He says, so it's 6 stages. He says, those who seek should not stop seeking until they find, stage 2. And when they find, they will be disturbed. And when they are disturbed, they will marvel. And when they marvel, they will reign. And when they reign, they will rest. So Thomas is suggesting it happens in 6 stages. The first one is seeking. The second stage is you're going to find answers. And the third stage is you're going to freak out. The answers are going to pull your model of reality out from underneath you, and you're going to want to run back and stop the search and go back to the kind of the stability of the old belief system or the old cosmology. But you have the courage to continue and to kind of to be upset, but to continue. What you find out is the illusion falls away. All of these kind of fake versions of reality dissolve, and now you begin to see what's really there. And now you're on stage 4, marveling. Wow, I never realized that this is really what it's about. Or, that is basically about love and compassion or whatever. Stage 5 then is you will rule or you will reign, which means now you cannot be controlled by anybody. But even if you're locked in prison with your hands manacled in solitary confinement, you're completely free. You're ruling because you have the freedom of being a child of God. And then finally, you can rest in the sense that there's no searching needed anymore because you have arrived at source. So there's nothing beyond source. And so for me, it becomes really, really important then, that we have the courage at the kind of the being upset stage to continue with the journey. And that's what I tried to do in this latest book of mine. I call it Setting God Free and Moving Beyond the Caricature We've Created in Our Own Image. So the core of the book is I put God on trial for crimes against humanity, and had a prosecution and a defense with archaeologists and mythologists and Jungian analysts and Bible scholars, all debating, coming to the conclusion that the God we've created and that we find largely in the scriptures is a kind of a projection of the shadow material of individuals and of communities and of the global family, and that we've worshipped and feared this kind of genocidal pathological maniac that we find in many religious traditions, in front of whom we cower. And then, having set God free, in the book I go on to say, how can you set spirituality free? If God is now set free and you realize God is a projection of ours, that we have made God in our own image and likeness, rather than acknowledging that we are made in God's image and likeness. If God is free at this stage, how do we set spirituality free? And the final section of the book is setting science free, looking beyond, what science, materialistic kind of monistic, reductionistic science, beyond that into the mysteries, of the scientific method.
That's beautiful. And I'm really looking forward to diving into that now, because you really articulated that beautifully. And when we talk about setting it free, what would you think this looks like in the individual state of awareness? And It's one thing for, we're sitting here, we're able to bask in the presence of God, right? And we can see and be present with that. And so you can make the argument there is no need to really continue a seeking process, right? If we recognize the totality of what that means. But in a way, there's also this, and I still feel a pull of like there's more to uncover, right? So it almost feels like we go on within this human experience. There's different, maybe this is just a projection of our shadow or our cultural phenomenon and the stories and mythologies we grew up under. I don't know if it's the natural cycles of human evolution, who knows? But there's this continual desire to keep seeking, even when we recognize, okay, God is in presence, right? God is in awareness, right? It's like we seek more ways to articulate that or uncover that or create expressions of that are unique, right? And be able to be of service of people. So how does one, I'd say, live in alignment with that freedom while still continuing to honor that process that still feels natural? Because, you can make the argument of once you recognize God as awareness, you could just sit in meditation and be free. Like you said, kind of almost like a solitary confinement where the external world doesn't matter. We are in presence, right? But in the same sense, if we go off into the mountains and meditate for the rest of our lives, we're almost practicing in a form of escapism from the realities, really neglecting our duty to be of service for the external world. So like, how do we find that balance of continual alignment in freedom when there is this sort of, I would say, juxtaposition in paradoxical nature?
Questions. You asked brilliant questions, Evan. The image that came to me when you started off just right now was driving at night in lashing rain, and it's pitch dark, and I realized I got two pieces of equipment that can help me out here. I got lights I can engage, and I got a windscreen wiper that can clear my windscreen. Otherwise, I can't see. I know the road. I've been on the road a million times, but right now I can't see the road. And right now, my lights are off and the windscreen wipers aren't working. So it's lashing rain. And so, the journey is perilous. So as somewhere I can reactivate the lights and the windscreen wipers. So for me, that's what practice is about. Because in the course of incarnation, we're constantly being rained upon and we're constantly being walked into dark alleys, which temporarily convince us, that we're not God stuff. That we're in great danger and that the world is really about darkness and danger. And so some great practices have arisen over the millennia. People who recognize, here's how you can keep your windscreen wipers working. Here's how you can keep the light on. So you're not fooled by the darkness or by the deluge, but that you can see through it. And so, for instance, Buddhism has this great phrase, enlightenment is an accident. But if you meditate regularly, you become accident prone. So it's like there are some practices that will allow you to stay more and more in the presence of the ultimate reality. And they differentiate between these two beautiful ideas in Buddhism called Turiya and Turiyatita. Turiya is the witnessing consciousness, that aspect of the self with a capital S that realizes, that it's not going to identify with the spacesuit. The spacesuit is simply a mission it's on during incarnation, but it's not going to identify it. So it can just witness what's happening to the spacesuit. But there's a place beyond that, Buddhism says, and they call it Turiyatita. And that is at the same time to witness, but not identify with the spacesuit, and at the same time to fully inhabit the spacesuit, and experience what it's like to be in a spacesuit. So to try to keep the two of them in balance, I have to fully experience what it's like to encounter separation or apparent darkness, while witnessing that this is a kind of an illusion, but it's an illusion which is I'm having to actually to encounter at this stage. And so it becomes really, really important to be able to experience apparent separation in order to know more than just intellectually that union is the ultimate state of reality. But I can know that intellectually, but until I've experienced it, physiologically and emotionally and mentally, I don't really, understand what true union means. And so it becomes very important then in the course of incarnation, what kinds of practices can I engage in so that I can walk in incarnation, play my part fully, at the same time not identify with the character I'm playing right now. And so when you look at like, you know, gurus living in the Himalayas that never interact with other human beings, and at the other end of the spectrum, you see Mother Teresa on the streets of Calcutta picking up little babies and, you know, nursing them and taking them home. You're like, we're a team. This is a team effort. And there are some people, you know, whose function is to be the quarterback, and others to be the wide receiver, and the other guy to be the nose guard. You know, some of them are very, very undramatic kind of roles, but they're necessary for the team to succeed and to win. And so we have to realize that in the course of an incarnation, I may be more inclined or kind of drawn to a particular kind of vocation, a hermit or a social worker. Now, I think we need to mix them a little bit each, but the kind of the balance between the two will be significantly different between the Guru in the Himalayas and Mother Teresa in Calcutta. So the question then I ask myself, okay, I'm Seán, an Irish guy with a Catholic priest right now in this incarnation. I actually live on a mountaintop, you know, 10 miles from civilization, you know, I'm totally off the grid. And so I'm trying to say, okay, I'm part hermit, maybe 80% of the time, and 20% of the time, I'm a clinical psychologist, you know, and I'm spiritual director for a group of people. That for me is the balance I'm trying to achieve right now. In a different incarnation, I had a different balance. And in a future incarnation, I might have a radically different balance. But I'm part of a team, and I have to try to play that game as best I can, while still trying to flavor a little bit all ends of the spectrum, so that I'm not totally identified with the hermit kind of archetype or with the Mother Teresa archetype.
Right. It's that I'd say acceptance of the difference and variance of roles. And it's interesting because I think our ego wants to and really yearns to have an identification with a particular archetype, right? It would be easy to latch on to the hermit and say, I am the hermit, or, you know, and put it in like tarot context. When I first started getting into it, I had I am the fool, right? And I kind of playing that role. And I think that's an archetype that I play
Yes.
within regularly, in the sense of just living through the spontaneous nature and the innocence of that. But in the same breath, that's not all I am. You know, I am the entirety of all the vastness of all, you know, it's really beyond words that we can describe. And it's interesting because when you were talking about union, it really made me think about it kind of comes back to this idea of the inversions that are present for people. Like, I think people find union through their shadow often. They find union through addiction. They find union through practices. And this is something I've heard Ram Dass talk about many times, is when he's talking about addiction, you know, people, you go into their addictions because it's a way they find union with God. And they have a moment where they are beyond ego, where they are beyond the supposed limitations that they've placed upon themselves, which is why they keep coming back into an addiction.
Yeah.
And so I think that shadow union really describes a lot of where people are at, and they find union within certain elements of our culture that, you know, it's meeting their spiritual desire, maybe unconsciously. You know, they don't realize that every time they get high, they're in a space with God. They don't necessarily realize that there's just something beyond the normal perceived consciousness, which is why they keep going into it. But as long as I'd say, live within that shadow and be unconsciously driven by it, you know, it's going to keep meeting us in the external world, as long as we choose not to recognize it within. And there is a real, almost, I would say, an internal judgment day that has to take place, where we take the responsibility for that shadow, if we actually want to move beyond it and really let it go in a healthy way. But as long as people are finding their needs met within that shadow, oftentimes there isn't the step to, like, maybe they desire a bit more, or they realize the practice is not beneficial for certain elements of their life, or it leaves them unfulfilled when they come back to their body and they realize, oh, they went into it again. But until they almost replace that with something that allows them to meet that same level of transcendence, they're going to continue to be driven by it. And that's sort of, you know, when I look at our cultural stories, I almost see, I guess I don't see alternatives being presented to most people. So it's no wonder that people stay asleep in their shadow, I guess you could put it, or they continue to be driven by that, because what alternatives are there present? And so it creates a difficult scenario where I think all we can do is continue to show up in light and show that what they're seeing there, it's really just the shadow representation of something transcendent beyond the individual self. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that? And I
So
guess
it's interesting that you mentioned Carl Jung. So Carl Jung was actually good friends with Bill Wilson, who founded AA. And Jung used the famous phrase in Latin. He said, people who are addicted in any way, it is, he said, spiritus contra spiritum, spirit against spirit. So they're looking for the wrong spirit, like the whiskey bottle is a form of spirit, literally, a form of spirit. And whereas, it's like two levels of spirit in kind of an adversarial kind of a condition. And Jung talked a lot about the notion of projection. And what he said about the shadow was very interesting. He said, the shadow is 80% gold. It is 80% unrealized potential. So, for instance, we project, hero worship on characters. Like, the World Cup just took place last Sunday, France or Argentina. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of people who are idolizing Mbappe and Messi. And guys who are just sitting on their couches drinking beer and eating popcorn, who never did a day's work in their life or are in training or aren't fit, but they got these hero worships. Yeah, go for it. Instead of getting off their backsides and getting out and walking and training or whatever, or playing sports. And so we project the unrealized gold on a whole bunch of people. And Jung said that's 80% of what projection involves. Instead of trying to develop those characteristics that we admire in our heroes, we just project it onto the hero and then watch them on television. The other 20%, he said, was a kind of repressed traumata. Now, he claimed then that projection is just part one of a two-part process. If I want to see a movie, there are two ways I can see a movie. I can go into the movie theater and I can sit in a comfortable pew and I can watch this big screen, which is like 40 feet by 30 feet. And I can watch these characters, these more than life-size characters, Roy Rogers, riding across in this white stallion, or, the Lone Ranger and Tonto or whatever, or whoever, and all these characters, and there's an illusion of time and motion and change, but there's nothing actually happening up there. It's happening in the projectionist box. So if I went up there, I could also watch the movie. I could take this roll of celluloid film and I could go through it frame by frame by frame, like 1 inch by 1 inch by inch. I'm seeing the same movie. But it's a really boring way to see the movie because I don't see any difference from frame to frame. So I can't see any movement. I can't see any time. I can't see any change, but I'm seeing the same movie. And so what happens is then I have to realize that in order to see what's actually up there, I have to project it out there and enlarge it. And then I see it more clearly. But I make a mistake if I think it's happening up there. So as small kids, there was a movie theater in Cork City where I grew up called the Lido. And it was a big barn of a building with a whitewashed wall, and wooden benches. And on Saturday mornings, they would have matinee performances for children. And the price of admission was 2 milk bottles. Milk was delivered in bottles. You clean the bottles and you'd give 2 milk bottles, and that's how you got in. But we'd fill our pockets with stones, and it would be a cowboy movie or, cowboys and Indians or whatever. And when the bad guy was creeping up on the good guy, we'd take out the stones and we'd start pelting the screen. Watch out behind you. Watch out behind you. And we're pelting the screen. And then the lights would come on, the movie would go, and a big usher would come in and just randomly take 2 or 3 kids and fire their asses out of the movie theater. And then we'll come back up again, and 10 minutes into it, we get so excited, we're throwing stones again. Now that's projection. That's the kind of illusion that the action is happening up there, and I can intervene and change the outcome by throwing stones at it. Now, in interhuman kind of interpersonal dynamics, we do the same thing. There's a darkness inside myself, in my heart, but I can't see it because it's on tiny little frames. So in order to see clearly what's in here, I have to project it onto you. And now I can see it very, very clearly. Now, Jung said that's only part one of a 2-part process. You're acting as a screen to help me see what's inside me. I should say, namaste, thank you for what you're doing, and then retroject it and work with it in here. But most of us don't. We think it actually is out there, and now I'm going to attack you and make you the bad guy. And so we do that as individuals, and we create interpersonal problems. We do it as communities, and therefore we create prejudices. And we do it as a world community, and we've created a God, a villain, a dark part called the devil, and a light part called God. And we act as if that's real and it's happening out there, and it's separate from us. So projection for me then, or the shadow, is a very important tool of self-discovery. I can't be prejudiced if I realize that most of what I'm prejudiced against is actually the projection of stuff I'm carrying within myself because of my history or whatever. And so instead I offer you, thank you for being a screen for me. I now take it back, and I'm going to work on the stuff inside here.
Right, absolutely. And I've had that realization where I get most of what we call the devil is really just our unmet shadow. And, we'll label it those things because we don't want to take the inner responsibility or recognize that the evil that we're seeing is actually also living within us. It's why we're able to perceive it and recognize it for what it is, because really the world serves the idea of externalization at all. It's an illusion. It's all a mirror for our own internal bandwidth. And for me, that's why I would love to hear your thoughts on this. It makes it so difficult for me to label. I look at a character, let's say a Bill Gates type, where obviously that what he is doing, he's very guided or misguided in a sense by his actions.
Yes.
But there's that fine line of, is this a case of Father, forgive him, for he knows not what he's doing, right? Or, is there a deliberate malice or malintention? I guess in a way, it almost, not that it doesn't matter, but at the same breath, am I able to see the evil perpetrated by a Bill Gates or a Klaus Schwab or all, I could go down the list of all these people. Can I see myself within their shoes and recognize in the same set of conditioning and frameworks, I am Bill Gates, right? And so it makes dealing with these people or these institutions, you have to be very conscious in how you choose to do so, because we can't just go and project the same type of energy onto Bill Gates that he's projecting onto humanity, even if he is being guided by his shadow, because then we're sort of reciprocating and creating exactly what it is that he's throwing out there, right? So it's a very fine line when we start recognizing we ourselves are in these people and in these institutions, because I think it radically changes how we show up and approach a lot of these situations.
So that's a very important distinction there then, because we can't just presume that all of these bad actors are actually just helping us out by showing up and playing the bad guys so the rest of us can develop. Because if that's the case, there's no such thing as free will. They have no freedom to be other than who they are, and we've no freedom to respond other than how we respond. So I think we have to be really, really careful that there is free will and freedom. And again, for me, that lies in the spectrum. Free will is the ability to do as I please. Freedom is the ability to do as pleases God. And so it's a spectrum of service to self versus service to other. So if there is free will, then we have to take responsibility for our actions in some ways. Now, if we were in different circumstances, any of us might behave in a different fashion. But I can't believe, for instance, I have this theory, for instance, that Mahatma Gandhi and Adolf Hitler were contemporaries. They were born around pretty much the same time. And there was a very famous American interviewer called Knickerbocker, who went to Europe in the 1930s, like 35, 36 or whatever. And he interviewed Carl Jung. And he said, can you tell me the difference between Mussolini and Hitler? Now, this was before World War II. Mm-hmm. And Carl Jung says, yes, I can. He says, Mussolini is the leader of Italy. Hitler is not the leader of Germany. Hitler has identified the kind of the shadow material in the Germanic soul. He's amplified it, he's ritualized it, he's given it a voice, and he's created a kind of a mythology around it. And so he's gathering up the collective shadow material of an entire ethnic group, and he's given it a focus and an enemy. Whereas Mussolini, just as a self-appointed character, who wasn't really representing, Italy. Now, I think the same thing is true that if Hitler had been born in India, he might have, brought to life, the kind of the shadow material of the Hindu soul, and there would have been, pandemonium in the Indian subcontinent. Whereas Gandhi had been born in Germany, he would have unearthed and articulated all of what is beautiful in the Germanic soul, and there would have been a second Renaissance. And so we have to realize that there actually are characters who are, inclined to evil in the technical sense, which I represented it, and people who are much more drawn to light and goodness. And there's free will involved in that process. So these characters didn't just sign up to play the bad guy so the rest of us could learn lessons that we could grow from. There's a free will there, and there's personal responsibility. And it's true, as you said, then, that if circumstances were different, I might behave a little bit differently from how I'm behaving right now. So circumstances do kind of influence. But you can put, a Mahatma Gandhi or Mother Teresa in the most dire of circumstances, and I believe their light will shine through. You could put another character like a Hitler into any circumstance, and they'll manage to find that which resonates with their own frequencies and lead a movement into darkness. Now, I think there are current characters, some of whom you mentioned, who are really given over to the darkness. There's an agenda which they're serving, and they're in positions such that they have the resources to voice their agenda on the rest of humanity. So I don't see these as kind of benign characters just offering us lessons to help us grow. I see these people as really self-serving, and therefore we find ourselves in circumstances where we can either grow or be crushed by it. That's the invitation for me. Grow or be crushed. Activate my own light or take refuge in my own darkness.
Right. Absolutely. And I definitely agree with you. And I think there is a very clear, a lot of people reference like a battle of good versus evil or light versus dark. And I think, that just kind of speaks to the nature of duality that almost feels like a timeless battle that's taking place within the human experience, right? And you're always going to have the characters who are, siding with evil. And, in one of your videos, I think you made a very a very good distinction about, unconscious evil and conscious evil versus, unconscious good and good. And I was wondering if you could expand upon that, because I think as long as we ourselves, the majority of people listening to this, as long as we ourselves are on a path to be conscious, we are going to align with that light. But in a sense, if we have blind spots, we have areas that are unconscious and are in our shadow, there is a very solid chance we are aligning with forces of darkness without recognizing it, right? So I was wondering if you could expand upon that and really bring that to light.
I love using kind of mathematical or geometric, kind of metaphors. So for me, this is a kind of a two by two matrix that I created. So it's like a window pane, two columns with two rows in it. So you've got 4 panes of glass. So one column represents the unconscious, another column represents consciousness, one row represents good, and the other row represents evil. So you've got 4 different positions. So for me then, somebody who's unconsciously evil is asleep. Somebody who's unconsciously good is simply lucky. Somebody who's consciously evil, is pathological, and somebody who's consciously good is enlightened. And so you got these 4 kind of different categories. Now, obviously, they're not cleanly kind of delineated. We kind of move across them. But it's a handy tool to realize the difference between unconscious, conscious, and good and evil, and to look at what is that going to look like symptomatically, as you deal with individual people. What are the symptoms you're going to see? And you're going to see, 4 basic categories: people who are asleep, and are therefore unconsciously doing bad stuff. People who are asleep and unconsciously doing good stuff, and they're just simply lucky. They happen to make the right choices, not by any great insight, but just through luck. And then there are people who are consciously dark, who are really trying to make life really difficult for a lot of people, and they're pathological. And then you get kind of the Mother Teresa figures who are consciously good, and for me, they're enlightened beings. So it's just a handy kind of a geometrical kind of metaphor to kind of look at symptom pictures.
Right. And, it's very helpful for me to use as a tool as well, because I can look at somebody like, a Bill Gates or a Klaus Schwab or any leader in our institutions. Well, I hesitate to even call them a leader, I guess, but somebody with influence. And we look at a lot of the ideas we've already talked about, like spiritual inversions. And, you know, things that are designed so intricately, and systems that are designed so intricately that it's not a coincidence that it's founded upon our own spiritual nature. I mean, certainly,
Yes.
maybe these individuals who run certain institutions or whatever it may be, they're aligned with their shadow beliefs,
Yes.
but they're very
Yes.
conscious about the impact that those beliefs have, especially when
Exactly.
they hold as much power as they do. So you it can be helpful to be able to label somebody like that.
Yes.
Okay, they are acting on pathology
Yes.
instead of, oh, they're just simply unaware. They're simply
Yes.
asleep, which, you know,
Yes.
if we look at just sort of the general population, just people, you know, average everyday people, and, you know, maybe they're going along with a lot of these ideas, or a lot of the people who, let's say, supported mandates or the shunning of
Yes. The
people for,
unvaccinated.
yeah. And, you know, you could say the same thing about Nazi Germany. The people who
Yes.
were,
Yes.
who followed Hitler's decrees, a lot of them
Yes.
were just
Yes.
average German
Yes.
people who just
Yeah.
sort of got swept up within that shadow.
Right.
You know, they're, even if their actions are aligned in evil, it doesn't necessarily make them pathological. It's just,
Mhm.
it's that idea of what I talked about earlier: Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Right.
Right. And
Right.
uh, I think if we can really, you know, I think that makes our everyday interactions
Yes.
even more meaningful, because if we can connect with those people on a heart to heart level
Yes.
and sort of get them to see the bigger picture of, hey, do you see how this action feeds into this pathology or this idea, and just sort of
Yeah.
start connecting dots?
Yeah.
You know, I think that's really how we make the change, because these people who are, I would say the smallest percentage is the consciously evil, those
Yes.
pathological people, regardless of how
Yes.
much power they hold, they're still the
Yeah.
smallest percentage.
Yeah.
You know, if you take away their little worker pawns, you know, their
Yeah.
unconsciously evil
Yeah.
people, then, you know, they're not going to hold any power over the
Yeah.
direction that
Yeah.
we choose to collectively move. You know, where
Yeah.
the collective goes, we sort of all are in a way bound to that choice.
Mm.
Um,
Right.
and, you know, I think that those small day to day interactions where we open our hearts and we choose to, uh, you know, not shun anybody, or not just based on the past or based on where they've been aligned out of a lack of awareness. I think there's real power that we hold to sort of uproot the foundation of the pathologies.
Right. I agree fully with you. And forgiveness is huge, but forgiveness is not the same as condoning, excusing, or kind of letting stuff off the hook. That you have to confront. I mean, you look at Hitler killing 6 million Jews, and you say, in some senses, was that just mismanagement? Was it like he was a poor leader or whatever? And obviously, it wasn't. It was absolutely a well thought out, intentional kind of an agenda. But I read some really interesting psychological studies during the Nuremberg trials subsequent to that most people were of the opinion that these soldiers who carried out this kind of devastating massacres where they literally lined up people in villages in Poland, made them dig mass graves, and then just mow them down and tumble them into it. And when they were asked, how could you do that? And the given wisdom was that, I was just following orders. But when they actually interviewed these soldiers, that wasn't the primary reason they did it. The primary reason they did it was they didn't want to look weak in front of their colleagues. So what a colleague had done it, and so I'm not going to look like a weakling, so I'm going to do it as well. So much more than following orders from people above them, they were driven by wanting to be part of a group and being accepted and not doing anything, not stepping out of line. And I see that even in our present situation right now. A lot of the danger is being done by people at the very top who are dark, dark forces, but a lot of the evil is being done by people who don't want to step out of line and are afraid to kind of raise their heads up. And so they go along with what their neighbors are doing. Yeah, not so much that they're following orders from the top, but that they want to appear to be the bad guys in the eyes of their neighbors. So they'll snitch on people who are not keeping the rules in some way. And that for me is the devastating kind of the deadly creep of the lack of courage to stand up for principles because you don't want to offend your neighbor, or because you're just taking orders from above.
Right. And, you know, I think there's real power in the, you know, because if you think about it historically, just to give a little backdrop, if you shun from the tribe or you go
Yes,
against the
yes,
nature of the
yes,
tribe,
yes, yes,
historically, like, that means imminent death, right? You know,
absolutely.
so there's I think, a deeply rooted survival instinct with the
Right.
going along with whatever the
Yes.
tribe is doing, even if the tribe appears to be
Yes.
going straight for a cliff. And,
Yes.
you know, you might have an awareness that the cliff is approaching, but,
Mhm.
you know, why speak up against it? Because outside of the
Mhm.
tribe anyways means death. So follow along until you meet your maker. Like either way, right? There's a level of safety, I think, that is provided
Absolutely.
within that. And so, you know, but even just one individual choosing to go on, you could say the lone wolf mentality. It's like, all
Yeah.
right, I recognize that this path, it's not, it's going to lead to our deaths. It's going to
Yes.
lead to something that
Yes.
is,
Yes.
I'd say, innately against my own understanding of ethics and spiritual
Yeah.
principles. You know, maybe lone wolf and death by myself would be better than following that agenda to its fullest, right? And but just that one act of courageousness and the one individual chooses to do that, the others start to see that and they can say, okay, I'm going to follow that leader. I'm going to follow that lone wolf. And then you create a new tribe and a new
Yes.
pack, right? And that's,
Yeah.
you know, I guess it's easier said than done, especially when your backs are against the wall or you're in a situation where, let's say, one of those SS officers in Nazi Germany and they see everybody else gunning them down, then it's going to be very difficult to speak up as that's happening. But the change isn't going to happen
Right.
if we don't engage in that. You know, I like to think about, you know, what's the future? You know, I don't have any kids. I would like to have kids one day, but if I have kids, you know, what is the world that I'm going to leave them? You know, it's going to be directly based on
Exactly.
the results of my actions today.
Absolutely.
And if I choose to just go along, well,
Yeah.
that's the world that I'm passing on down to them.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
I can't even say that I attempted to change anything for them.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's a great that's something I tend to stick to. And a question that Paul Check actually gave me when I asked him
Okay.
a question, he responded with a question to one of my questions. He said, well, what would love do now? Right.
Yes.
And you can continue
Right.
to be guided by that.
Yeah.
I mean, then it's a little easier to make those tough decisions because love isn't always light and
Right.
rainbows and butterflies necessarily.
Right.
You know, love is a very powerful force. So if we can align our actions with that and sort of let go of the fear of consequences of doing the right thing, well, then we're always going to, in theory, do the right thing. And we can,
Right.
I'd say, have a sense of purpose and deeper meaning
Right.
just within that alone.
Right. So you're absolutely right. And so I maintain that the function of the prophet is not to predict the future, it's to prevent the future.
Mm-hmm.
So the prophet is somebody who can see very clearly what is and where we're headed. So the prophet is the person who's trying to call us back into alignment with our covenant with God. It's not somebody who's kind of saying, you know, in 3 months' time, X is going to happen. You know, I'm a prophet. And so I think, for instance, that there are 7 different timelines that we're buffeted by: 2 in the past, 2 in the present, and 3 in the future. So there's a real past that actually happened, that went down all over the planet, of which we are the product. We're the product of all the kind of the things that happened before us globally. Then we're products of the historical past, what we were told happened, a lot of which didn't actually happen, but it's an effort to program us. And so we're influenced by that. So we're influenced by what really happened, and we're influenced by what we were told happened, even if some of it wasn't true. There are 2 present versions of the present. There's what's really happening right now in our world, and we're kind of being influenced by that, all of it, some of it unconsciously. And then there's what we're being told is happening right now, and we call that propaganda. It may not be true at all, but it's a huge influence on us. Then there are 3 versions of the future. There are people who believe that the future is an inevitable, fated outcome. We have no control of it. We're just lemmings marching over the cliff. No, I don't believe in that piece. But there are 2 versions of the future. One is the probable future, what's likely to happen if we don't change what we're doing. And then there's the possible future, which could happen if we do change what we are doing. And the function of the prophet is here. The function of the prophet is to be able to see this is where we're headed, you know, and he's to prevent that from happening, not just predict what's going to happen. So he's giving us a possible future by kind of engaging with the covenant with God, the soul contract we have. And it's all about, you know, honoring the covenant. And the covenant was not a special agreement that God made with a particular tribe. It's the agreement every soul made with Source when they volunteered for incarnation. So it's coming back to that as individuals. and as a world community, coming back to the covenant. And so then the great artist or the great prophet is the person, who's calling us back into alignment with that reality. And they can do it by their actions or by their words. And Mother Teresa will do it by what she does, and Martin Luther King will do it by what he says.
Right.
Yeah.
By your fruits you shall know them, right? And that's exactly, I think it gives us all a deeper sense of purpose and meaning in this time to step into the role of the prophet that we are, because we all have a deep purpose and deep reason that we came here in this time. And I think just knowing in that, it allows us to go on this hero's journey to see what, because I think it's very clear at this point what the transhumanist future looks like, what their ideals are, how that manifests into reality, right? And so, and when you recognize the end goal or the destination, you can start to see the steps in the journey along the way. You start to see how the smaller things line up with that. And so if you know the steps and you know that journey, you can intervene in those stepping points and really take action along that. And I would, and so as a question built upon that, not to ask for a prediction of the future necessarily, but it kind of takes us back, it kind of brings us full circle on the first question when we were talking about myths and stories and ideas. If you were asked to write a new or tell it a story of a new cultural myth that is underlining who we are and reconnects people with the true nature of themselves and with I'd say the free God as you describe in your book and in your work, how would you tell that story, or how would you tell the true nature of who we are in a new myth that can be, I would say, the center for I'd say the times that we are stepping into, where we are choosing collective freedom and collective reunion with one another, with God, and with ultimately the true nature of ourselves?
That's a brilliant question, Evan. It's a brilliant question. And so I'm a really big believer that the most complex of ideas can be articulated in the simplest of stories. That somebody who really understands their data, can really, that Einstein talking to a kindergarten class, could explain relativity theory in a way that is comprehensible to the kids. So the ability to articulate the most complex of phenomena in the simplest of stories. There's something about stories that engage, and this has been proven even kind of neurologically, that stories activate the memory in ways in which data can't, and that stories activate the imagination in a way in which the intellect can't. And so once more, I differentiate between fantasy and imagination. For me, fantasy is the ability to make up stuff that's not real. Imagination is the ability to volitionally shift my state of consciousness, enter into different dimensions, encounter different entities and energies that reside in those different frequencies, interact with them, learn from them, and bring that learning back and cross-fertilize it with this alleged waking consciousness. And so imagination, I believe, is the primary tool in the tool bag of a great scientist, of an artist, of a prophet, of little children. They've got extraordinary imaginations. And it's not because they're fantasizing and making up imaginary companions. These imaginary companions are the children surfing other dimensions and having real encounters. And so spending time with little children, not patronizingly tapping them on the head and saying, that's sweet, but actually entering into their games so that we can kind of climb onto their surfboard, and surf the wave with them and encounter what they're encountering. Now, I think people who've done plant medicine have managed to do that. People who are meditators have managed to do that. People who spend quality time in nature have been able to do that. So there are many ways into this kind of a new myth making, and it's going to seem so simple that the intellectuals will say that's just a myth, and they think myth is a bad thing. Anybody who doesn't understand myth, that thinks that myth is a kind of a simplistic story made up by pre-literate civilizations that had no knowledge of science, doesn't understand either science or mythology. Because in some senses, the scientific method was not invented by Francis Bacon in the 1600s, or by Isaac Newton, or by, any of those 16th or 17th century people. When I look at the scientific method, I see about 10 steps always. It doesn't matter what the area of study is. It could be geology, it could be mathematics, it could be psychology, it could be physics. And so the steps are always these. The scientist makes a bunch of observations in her field of interest. So observations is the first stage of it. The second stage is gathering the data as a result of the observations she's made. The third stage is to see, can she identify any putative pattern in the data? The fourth stage is, yeah, I think I can see a pattern. Do I have a hypothesis that would explain that putative pattern? Stage 5 is, I now have to set up some kind of an experimental protocol to see if my hypothesis actually explains the pattern. Stage 6 is, I find out, yeah, it seems to. Stage 6 is, I have to have some other scientists replicate it in their laboratories, because it could just have been a statistical aberration, my findings. So now we get a bunch of other scientists repeating the experiment and finding the same result. Now we have a principle established in the field. A whole bunch of principles then create a model of the field. At some stage, anomalous data begin to surface, which can't be accommodated in the old model. I have to kind of tweak the model to force in kind of the new data. But at some stage, so much anomalous data begin to surface that there is no way, no matter what I do, that the old model can explain it. So now I've got to dispense with the old model and create a brand new model that can explain all the old data and the new data. And that happened to us twice in the 20th century, with relativity theory in 1905 and with quantum mechanics in 1920. Now, I see the very, very same thing when I look at the mystical literature. Mystics do exactly the same thing. So mystics in their field of interest, whether it's meditation or time spent in nature or ritual or liturgy, whatever it is, yeah, there's a field of interest. They make observations in their field. They begin to collect data. They begin to see, is there some kind of a pattern in my data? They come up with a hypothesis to explain it. Now they do some kind of experimentation. I think that every time I go out in nature and I sit down very, very quietly, making no noise, and watching birds building nests or spiders building webs or fish jumping out of the water to catch a fly, I feel this extraordinary serenity, and I'm gone beyond my intellect and my sensorium, and I'm in a totally different place. So that's my finding. Now I'm going to talk to Ivan and say, have you tried this? You say, what are you talking about? I say, meditation in nature. Oh, yeah. I spend a lot of time. And what do you find? And you find exactly the same stuff that I did. So now we're replicating it. We know now this is true. So now we're going to build, a new model of reality. Reality is not just what the sensorium delivers. Reality is what the imagination can deliver. And so we've created a model of reality which is much, much, much bigger than the sensory-derived model. Now, at some stages, we live other experiences, like an encounter with an ET, or a dream experience, or a near-death experience. Now there are new data. I'm going to have to expand the existing model. And at some stage, new data which is so mind-blowing that I'm going to have to radically overhaul the old model and create a new. I see that very same thing happening in mysticism. So it's not like that mysticism in an old-fashioned way, which was pre-scientific and could only kind of resolve in kind of navel-gazing, narcissistic navel-gazing. It delivered a model of reality which is far superior to that which can be delivered merely by the sensorium. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I think. If I were to create a simple story for our times, I want to express it in very simple language in story form. So I would imagine that I'm speaking to a bunch of 4 or 5-year-old kids sitting together around a campfire. And I would make up a story, and I'm really good at making up stories because my grandfather was a storyteller. And talking to those 5 and 6-year-old kids, I would give a new story that accounted for the origins of the universe, the origins of human being, our destiny, and what the abilities are resident within the human soul and human psyche. And I would spin out a story, but there were 2 forms of storytelling when I was a kid growing up in Ireland. One is where you had a storyteller, and we called it the Seán ÓLaoire. That was the official name for the storyteller. And the storyteller had memorized a saga or a great myth and is telling the listeners, who were then surfing their own imaginations to drill down on this. But there was another form of storytelling where we'd sit in a circle and the first person would throw out a statement, I'm looking at an oak tree. The next person has to pick up on that line, do anything he wants with it, and say, oh, I can see a blackbird sitting on the oak tree. The third guy says, oh, I see the blackbird, and I know the blackbird is out gathering food for little children in the nest. And the fourth person picks, and it can go totally orthogonal. Somebody can make a statement which is totally out of sequence with what's gone before, and we go off in a brand new direction. And so we're going to take branches and branches and branches. But finally, the group creates the story, and everybody has participated, and we get to some kind of a conclusion that everybody has participated in, and that we all feel enlivened by and animated by. Now, that's the kind of story I'd want to be telling.
And you and I both. And, I think the beautiful thing about this type of process is that it would forever be changing and it would forever be updated, right? The story you tell around the campfire, when those kids reach your age, ideally, they have made their own modifications of the story, and the collective has agreed upon and recognized deeper levels of truth within that story, right? And you continue to expand upon it and create this resonant myth that is not just passed down but expanded upon. And I think if we can, in a lot of ways, maybe the frameworks for the types of story that we're speaking of is already present, within mystical traditions, within like you talked about, incorporating the scientific method, incorporating all these different models that we have come to use to understand reality. It's all of it's already there. Like, we already have a lot of the quote unquote, I think, answers that people are looking for. I think it's just about intertwining them harmoniously into this new myth and this new understanding, and something that we can all agree upon and see the truth within. It's, I think it is more just about an awareness of that, as opposed to even having to prove it. Because once people come to recognize the deeper truths, they start to recognize maybe how they've been outsourcing identity to ideology or whatever it may be. There isn't a need for convincing to understand the actual truth. And so for me, that leaves me with immense hope, and that this story, it's already emerging, and it's just waiting for the right storyteller, the right opportunity to emerge, and really at the perfect time.
Yeah. Brilliant.
So.
I love how your mind works. And the image that came to me as I heard you right now is that you're describing the tree of life. There are new branches springing out. There are new twigs on the new branches. There are new leaves on the new twigs. But they're all connected to the root system. And they're both feeding each other, that the roots are feeding the leaves and the leaves are feeding the trees through photosynthesis. So it's not just a one-way kind of a feeding system. Everything on the tree is feeding everything else on the tree.
Yes, absolutely. Well, when you were speaking, I had the imagery of the tree of life pop into my head too. So
Wow,
I was going to say we're on the same wavelength then. And that's funny how that works. But Seán, we're at almost hour and a half, hour 45 minutes. Is there you have any other thoughts or ideas or ways you'd like to, I guess, conclude or leave the listeners with something? I don't know. That's kind of a loaded question in a sense, to give final thoughts or reflections, or, also I'd love to hear, what sort of projects you have working on and where listeners can go to find you. And, also what we're going into 2023. So it's a new year. If you have any, thoughts about the upcoming new year and what's going on for you, what's on the horizon for you? I'm excited.
What's on the horizon for me is, I'm lucky enough because of an interview I did a year and a half ago with Regina Meredith that put me in contact with a whole bunch of other people I've been in contact with since, including yourself right today. Great thinking minds, loving souls who are kind of the torch bearers, walking out into the woods, into the darkness, and trying to kind of help people who seem lost. And so it's a pleasure to me that I've been putting a lot of focus on wanting to talk to people like yourself, because you are the torch bearers, and particular a man who's much younger than I am. I'm almost 77. And that for me, you're carrying it on to the next generation. And with God's help, when you have children of your own, that you're going to be the storyteller, passing this stuff to the next generation. So for me, that's a major pivot I'm doing a lot of writing still as well, and I'm hoping that people, will be able to read that material because it spurs their imagination and gives them hope as well. So that's where I'm pivoting right now. I have a community for whom I say mass on a regular basis. Like next Sunday is Christmas Day, and so that's one outreach. The other outreach is doing interviews. I'm doing a lot of writing, so I'm trying to see if I can be one of the torchbearers, one of the storytellers for our time, and the realization that the darkness is a great time to be telling stories. A story has far less effective, under fluorescent lighting in a school hall than it is sitting around a campfire under the Milky Way galaxy. And we're in a dark time right now. It's a great time to be telling stories.
Absolutely. Well, I can definitely say with assurance that you are one of the torchbearers, and I would say your torch has an immense amount of light that's coming from it as we move forward, because I think the ideas and your wisdom, the incorporation of your wisdom and knowledge, heart-centered approach, it's truly remarkable to be just in presence of it. And I think there's going to be a deep level of integration after I get off of this podcast to really take in the level of truth that we reached here today. So, whatever.
What I've loved about it, even as that has been a conversation, it wasn't just an interview, you kind of picking my brains. It was us, sharing each other's expertise, imagination, and soul. That it was a conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, that's what I love. And that's feels like one of my ways of engaging in these times is to just have conversations like these. And so, as we move forward, I'd love to keep the conversation going, hopefully the first of many, because you get, it's funny because the first time I mentioned James Tunney earlier. He's Irish as well. He's like, just be aware, you're talking to an Irishman now, so we can keep talking forever. And he's like, I know with your name, you got it in you too. So I'm like, yeah. So, I'd love to keep the conversation going. And I think what we're working towards is we're both tapped into that same deeper truth and that reverence and bringing about that same light. So, I think it's the direction. There's a lot of darkness, but the light that is shining within the darkness, that is what I'm feeling connected to, and feeling very, I don't know, I would say hopeful, I guess. I don't know if that encapsulates the full feeling, but hopeful about the future and optimistic in terms of the direction we're moving in. So
awesome.
A
big hug to you.
Yes, big hug. Merry Christmas, and I hope you have a wonderful holiday. And I'll have this podcast out before the end of the year. I should have it out next week.
Great.
So
that's great.
It'll be fresh. It'll still be a fresh conversation. I don't like to do the waiting a few months, because by that time I'm ready to have another conversation. So
I hope Santa Claus finds out you've been a good boy during the year.
Yeah, well, I hope so too. I'd like to think so. Did my best this time. So
good.
Awesome. And thank you to all the listeners for tuning in as well and engaging with us. And we'll see you all on the next episode.